After a response sheet has come out, people know their raw score. Now, how much will be the scale score? How much will be the change? So let's look at a few examples from previous years to understand the change. We'll take up last 3-4 years ka data and try to figure out what the change can be. Now, obviously, each slot will have different uh, normalization or scaling which will happen. So let's look at it. Now, uh, raw score is what you have actually scored in the exam. So when you got a response sheet, you got a score in the exam. Scale score is the score on which your percentile is calculated. Okay, after scaling the raw score. So that means if the paper was difficult or people in your slot have scored less, they will scale it up. If people in a slot have scored more, they will scale it down and so on. Now, what's the difference? It could actually vary up to 10 marks. I mean, your marks can go up or down by approximately 10 marks, the total marks, which is there. So it varies on a difficult level of paper and on different slots. Each section will have different scaling. I mean, a slot 1 could have different scaling, or each VRC could have different scaling, a con could have different scaling, and the overall scaling is the sum of the scaling in each section. So let's look at some examples, right? Also possible that the higher marks and the lower marks will have different scaling. Maybe higher marks they've scored scaled up and the lower marks they've scaled down. We'll look at the reason as such. Now, one example, like let's say slot 1 from CAT 23 paper. So if you look at the VRC section, there was a slight scaling up which happened, very slight. Whereas DLR section, the scaling was quite more than, I mean, here it was just point scaling, here it was almost 1-2 mark scaling in DLR. Whereas Cont, it was scaled down, but except for lower score, it went up a bit, but it was scaled down. So overall, verbal was scaled up, DLR was scaled up, Cont was scaled down, but Cont was scaled down a little bit. So overall, there was a scaling up that happened. So overall, most of the students, the scaling went up. Slot. Same if you look at slot 2, the VRs went up, but if you look at lower scores, the scaling went down. At higher scores, the scaling was up. The scaling was up by more than 5 or 6 marks in the higher scores. But at the lower scores, the scaling was, so it changed accordingly. There's a little mismatch out here, but yes. If you look at DLR, the scaling was slightly up. Okay, both at higher and lower scores. And Cont, higher scores, the scaling was up, but at lower scores, the scaling was down. So again, verbal scaled up overall, but at lower scores, it was scaled down. DLR scaled up. Cont scaled up, but at lower score it was scaled down, and overall scaled up, but at lower scores they went down. Like 26 it went down, 25.14, but overall top scores it went up. But final scaling is basically based on individual scaling that happened. Some of the individual scale scores will give you final scale score. So that means the scaling could be different for higher scores and lower scores. I mean, that's possible. So last year at a very high score, the scaling happened almost 8 marks, but then the scaling happens, anything as such. Slot 3, scaling went down. So if you look at except for lower scores, the scaling went up. So in VRC, scale down, but for lower scores, the scale went up. DLR scaled down drastically. Okay, so slot 3 was easier last year for DLR, and Cont it went up except for some scores it went, overall it got changed a little bit. So that means scaled up, scaled down a little bit, and so on. So overall, there was a scaling down mainly because of DLR effect. Because of DLR effect, it went scaled down. That's what happened last year. Same way, I mean, if you look at this is the overall for CAT 23, what we have discussed, scaling down, scaling up. Same way, if you look at CAT 22, slot 1, verbal scaled up, marks went up, right? DLR scaled up, Cont scaled down, and overall scaled up. So if you look at the change in marks, it was almost 11 marks, 8 marks, 7-8 marks. So there could be a change of 7 to 8 to 10 marks which could happen depending on the slots which are there. Same if you look at like slot 2, verbal scaled up, DLR scaled down. There was a drastic decline in DLR scores. Cont scaled up a bit. Okay. Overall, there was slight change, slight scale up because there was a upscaling in VA and downscaling in DLR. Overall, sort of a little bit of scaling up. But again, it depends. Now, it is chance that you have very high score in DLR, whereas scaling takes down drastically. In that case, the overall score could scale actually down. And same with slot 3, if you look at it, the VRC was scaled down, okay, because the paper was easy, so the people scored high marks, so it was scaled down. DLR was scaled up, marks went up, okay. Cont was scaled up again, and overall scaled up or down depending on which section scored more. If you scored very high in verbal, your overall scaling would have come down. If you scored high in DLR account, the scores must have gone up. Right? That's how your scaling happens. Again, the scale change in here was not much, hardly 1, 2, 3 marks difference between the overall score and the scale score. Unlike in slot 2, if you look at or slot 1, there was a drastic change, almost 10, 11 marks of scaling that happened, one up. But slot 2 and slot 3, there was a minor change in scaling, not much. Right? Now, if I look at overall CAT 22, this is the scaling score which happened. Again, I'm looking at CAT 21. Slot 1 scaled up, DLR scaled up, con scaled down, overall scaled up. So overall, there was a scaling of 3 to 4 marks for higher marks. For lower marks, it was a lesser scaling as such. Again, it depends on what you scored. If you scored very high marks in con, chances are possible chance that your scores could be scaled down. Same with slot 2, verbal scaled up, DLR scaled down, con scaled down. Overall, there was a scaling down. If you look at almost 4 to 5 marks scaling at a higher marks. At lower marks, less scaling, but yes, that was a scaling that happened. And slot 3, verbal was scaled down. Okay. DLR and con was scaled up. Overall, there was a scaling up. So if you look at almost 3, 4 marks of scaling up that happened. So that's where the scaling. So scaling takes place across section. Your overall scaling depends upon the scaling of individual this one. In some cases, the overall scaling could go up to 10 marks for higher marks. Normally for lower marks, scaling is not up to 10 marks. Up to 70, 80, there's a chance of scaling up and down, but normally less of scaling down, but scaling up by 10 marks or so. At lower scores, the scaling doesn't take place to 10 marks. It must be lesser than that. Right? Same if you look at CAT slot 2, scale down, scale up, verbal, DLR and con. And overall, there was a scaling up. If you look at, there was almost 6, 7 marks of scaling up at a higher scores. Slot 1, verbal scaled up, DLR scaled down, con scaled up. Overall, again, they're scaling up. So almost 2, 3 marks of scaling up at a higher score. And slot 3, it was scaling down. So scale down for VA, scale up for DLR, but scale down for con. Overall, there was up or down based on where have you scored higher marks. So if you look at here, the scaling was down. Okay, why the scaling was down? Because he scored less marks in DLR but more marks in VA and con, whereas scaling was down. Whereas here the scaling was up. Why the scaling was up? Because he scored higher marks in DLR where the scaling was up, other sections down. That's what determined. Right? I hope this helped to understand what the raw score and scaling score is there. I hope you like the video. If you like, do press the like button and do subscribe to our channel. Thank you.